Hello, everyone. Glad you're here with us today as we work through the book of 1 Corinthians, one big idea at a time. If you've got a second while we're doing this kind of introduction and press release or whatever, if you could just like the page, Facebook, or follow us on Instagram, follow the Minden Collective on YouTube, all those little things, even if that's not maybe where you access it, maybe you're a podcast person, maybe you're a Facebook person, maybe you're an Instagram person, maybe you're a YouTube person. All those different things help people get the content out more. So maybe you just watch on YouTube, like the page for sure if you're on YouTube, but follow the podcast if you can, or like us on Facebook or Instagram, and then vice versa for all those other platforms and mediums. This project continues to grow, and it's thanks to each and every one of you. So while I'm kind of going through this, just take a second and go do that for me if you've got a free hand. So today we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, a fascinating text. One of the ones I've enjoyed most, really, kind of unexpectedly here in 1 Corinthians. One of the beautiful things about getting to work through slowly and not missing any verses is you have to deal with verses that you may have kind of glazed over before and not thought about carefully. And this is one that I was really blessed by personally to look at. So let's look at it together. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. For Christ our Passover also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let's celebrate the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of truth and sincerity. The past 2 weeks, we've been covering this principal text on church discipline, withdrawal of fellowship, excommunication, churching, removal from the body, or any other number of monikers. And this is going to continue through the entire chapter, through this week's study and next week's study with it. Though based on kind of what I've seen in this text and next week's text, how big that's shaping up to be, it appears we probably could have got an episode or two more out of this, but I'm trying to turn over a new leaf and behave, so bear with me. Regardless, though, Paul has been addressing a specific situation of immorality in the church, which has been infecting the life of it. And it's hard to say if this is at the center of it. It may just be symptomatic of the greater issues that are going on in Corinth. Moreover, it's affecting the witness of the church because the world looks on their behavior contemptibly. Specifically, the behavior that Paul calls out is shockingly an incestuous relationship between a man and presumably his stepmother. And it's not just being, ignored or swept under the rug, but it's being celebrated. To Paul's shock, he tells them that they should be mourning this sin, to the point that the man's refusal to repent would lead them to remove him from their presence on their own. They should be able to see that, hey, this guy's got to go already. However, because they've not removed him, Paul declares in no uncertain terms that they should do so. As they're gathered together in the name of Christ, in the authority of Christ, and the direction of Christ, they should turn him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. The mindset behind this, though, as we say, for the destruction of the flesh, isn't just vindication or vindictiveness or pain. The mindset is the salvation of the soul of the sinner. That's a mouthful. The salvation of the soul of the sinner. Because allowing him to endure the consequence of sin is going to bring him back to Christ's graciousness. By removing the guardrails of Christ's goodness and the people of God, it's going to allow him to see what he's doing. Furthermore, the other reason they've got to do this is to affect others. The steps must be taken here to ensure that every member knows that Christians take church seriously. Every member of the body's got to know that what we preach, we are serious about. And so these steps have to be done in order to ensure that result. Moreover, this sort of attitude really creates a cancer in the congregation that affects everybody. And today, Paul is going to extend the metaphor he started last time in our big idea, which is to celebrate with purity. Celebrate with purity. To understand what it means to celebrate with purity, we're going to look at number 1, make a fresh start. Number 2, Christ is our Passover. And number 3, be influenced by truth. So make a fresh start. Christ is our Passover, and be influenced by truth. So start, Passover, and truth are those words that we're going to govern our study today. The first idea comes off the previous one, where Paul has invoked this metaphor of leaven, and perhaps in some sense this text really kind of belongs together with the last one, but we're trying to cut these in helpful ways. So he's using the idea of leavening in 2 ways that we need to understand. The first is the idea of influence. By mass, leavening agents make up a very small percentage of a bread recipe. I didn't have the stats last time, but there's a recipe me and my wife make, a bread recipe. It's soda bread, for those of you who care. The ratio to flour of flour to baking soda is on the order of 100 to 1. 100 to 1 en masse. The fact that leavening or leavening agents are a minuscule proportion of the recipe, though, doesn't keep it from having a profound impact, causing the bread, in this case, to double or even triple in volume. The influence this man has, who is cohabitating with his stepmother, on the church shouldn't be underestimated either. Because of the awkwardness, the difficulty, and just kind of the general desire to avoid dealing with the situation, we excuse ourselves by saying, it's not harm anyone, it's not a big deal, because it's so isolated. Paul says that a little sin like this will have a negative impact on the congregation, and even if it seems tiny, its impact is exponential to its size. The second idea around leavening, though, that comes to our text today, expanding last week's text, is the idea of impurity or uncleanness. That is, in this context, leaven bears a connotation of impurity. Paul says that this old leaven, or this leaven, needs to be cleaned out, and this word old here is an old leavening, so it can be a new lump. This theme of old and new is super important to the next couple of points. But suffice it to say that Paul is calling for something transformative in the lives of the Corinthians. But notice this transformation is indicative of an inward change that's already occurred. He says, as indeed you're already unleavened. That is, they are already new. So Paul is calling them to clean out the old so that they may be new, because in fact you all are already new. This fresh start that Paul wants to invite them into is a prayer for them to live into this extant identity. They already have this identity of being pure and unleavened, and Paul says, hey, let's live like that. To which, coming to our next point, Paul says, Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed for us. Here we see that part of what's in Paul's mind as he runs this kind of leaven metaphor. If that doesn't really make any sense. You know, he's kind of using this leavening thing and Passover. Then hang with me, especially when we get into the second point. We need to understand this Passover stuff and then leavening. Some of you kind of know where this is going. You're like, okay, I get it. But for those of you who don't, hang with me. We'll try to build this out. Passover is, in fact, one of the most important feasts for Jewish people. And for many of us non-Jews, it's perhaps the most famous one, if not the most important one. The inception of Passover occurred when Israel was in Egyptian bondage. God had sent 9 plagues through the hand of Moses on the Egyptians, and those 9 plagues had served to harden the heart of King Pharaoh. They served to harden his heart, so it just made it further to where he was in further rebellion against God to see these plagues. But in the 10th plague, God came and visited judgment upon the land of Egypt by entering the house of all and killing the firstborn. But here's the thing. As God comes to judge the sin of Egypt, he has to be just in that judgment. And so he must come and judge the sins of Israel that's dwelling in Egypt. How is God going to get around this? Well, he's not going to get around it at all. God in his mercy is going to give them an opportunity to have those sins covered or paid for. So God gives them the opportunity to kill a lamb, and they paint the blood on the doorpost and over the door. In this case, as God would come and visit the iniquity of the Egyptians and all the people dwelling in the land of Egypt, God would see the blood of that lamb, see the death of that lamb, and that would appease his wrath for sin. So instead of the death of this firstborn that's going to happen here for the rest of the people in Egypt to appease this sin as the just punishment for it, the death of that lamb would be a substitution for that instead. The people here, they were to abide in the house all night, and that lamb wasn't just blood. They would actually take the lamb and they would feast on it. It would be a feast for them and their family. If their house was too small to have a lamb, they'd have a neighbor over and have a conjoined party for everybody here. In many ways, this becomes the founding event of Israel. There's a really good case to make that this is really kind of Israel's start as a nation. God ordains this feast to go on yearly. So they celebrated this once where God actually came and passed over the sins of Israel. He passed over those houses when he saw the blood. But God ordains this as a yearly memorial for them coming out of Egypt and becoming his people. As we mentioned here, the reason it's called Passover is because God passed over the Israelite houses and didn't visit his wrath upon them, but he was appeased by the blood of that lamb there. Paul declares that Christ is our Passover. In fact, as you recall, Christ was sacrificed on the feast of Passover, and he, as the firstborn of God the Father, firstborn over all creation, he dies kind of as the firstborn and as the lamb there, which is an interesting connection. as he is taking the Passover feast with his disciples there before his death, he notices that he's instituting the Lord's Supper. He declares the fruit of the vine represents the blood of the new covenant there. So just as Passover was inaugural for the Israelites as the people of God, Christ's death was a Passover of the new covenant. It fixes the church as a new Israel, with Christ leading a new exodus specifically out of sin. All right, with this, we see that Paul is what's getting at with the leaven comments. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, notice what he says here is that for Christ is our Passover. So he calls them to purge out this old leaven. For Christ, our Passover has been sacrificed, and says, therefore, let us keep this feast not with old leaven. So this idea of Christ being a Passover and this getting rid of leaven are intimately connected. And like I was going to mention a second ago that I mentioned earlier, makes a lot of sense if you understand Jewish festivals. If you don't understand Jewish festivals and you're just kind of hanging on here, you're like, what's the causality here? Here's the idea. Paul is bringing in a lesser-known feast that occurred in concert with Passover, and that is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Immediately following the instructions for Passover in Exodus chapter 12 are instructions for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This was a feast that was concurrent with Passover. We'll talk about that in a second. In the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they were to, you guessed it, purge the leaven from their houses. There was to be no dough that had yeast in the house. As it turns out, Passover was actually the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Feast of Passover is on that Sabbath, and that marks the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which goes on for a full 7 days until the next Passover. Paul has mapped this new exodus onto the church. They're participating in this. Christ has offered himself as a Passover lamb, and that means that the church, metaphorically, is now in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that we've got the job of purging this out. So just like the people, upon sacrificing the Passover lamb, needed to purge their houses, so too we must purge the leaven from among us. About this, Paul says, let's celebrate. Let's keep the feast. Let's celebrate this Feast of Unleavened Bread. Getting rid of the leaven from your house, it may seem like, well, that's kind of a bummer of a thing to do. You can't have leavened bread, but it was a feast. It was a good thing. It was a time of celebration. These feasts are meant to be times of rejoicing. And as you think about this text is really heavy because we kind of come back to the idea of church discipline and removing people from the fellowship of saints. But at least in principle, the notion of removing leaven is a positive thing. It's a thing that is a good thing to do. In this case, the leaven isn't a physical rising agent, but it's an evil heart. Notice he says we should celebrate this exodus of God, celebrate this feast in Christ by removing malice and wickedness, that is, ill intent and evil, but instead have sincerity and truth. Just as purging leaven represents purity, we must remove the impure actions and the impure motives that we carry from our hearts in order to represent Christ, who has made us new, and in particular, the impure people, and not just people who sin, but people who are, we might say, rotten to the core in this way. They aren't sincere. They aren't acting in truth. So now we kind of have Paul's picture in his mind about this leavening and its influence on the body. We need to recognize that even a little leaven has an effect. And thus, we need to be about the work of purifying ourselves to make sure we don't allow the effect of impurity to ravage the church. Principally, we need to realize that Christ has been slain, and the right response is purity of action. Just like those who had leaven in their houses after the Passover sacrifice, they were cut off from Israel. Similarly, those who have allowed the leaven of sin to persist in their hearts after the sacrifice of Christ will be cut off from the new Israel. And as we mentioned, this isn't about a single sin. This isn't about someone trying to do the best they can and struggling. This is about living in malice and wickedness, without sincerity, without truth. This is about those who are living in hypocrisy, those who are putting up one front, but yet are doing something else. Those are the people that need to be removed. And this is a positive thing. It's a heavy thing. It's a grieving thing. But ultimately, it's in the heart of God to bless us, to call us to do this. And so as we think about this text, we think about what it means, we think about living it out. Do you have a sobriety concerning sin? Do you realize how serious it is to have sincerity in our hearts? To not act with wickedness, to not act with malice, to not act with ill intent. Do you realize that purity and sincerity are non-negotiables? It's not something that just, well, we should be pure, we should be sincere, but it's something that must be the case. Because Christ has been sacrificed for us, we must live differently. We must purify that in ourselves and within the church for those who are not striving to make those steps. Is it clear that, as we mentioned, this is non-negotiable? Do you see the high value that God has put on sincerity and purity of heart? And is your heart pure? Before you can look at others and strive to remove them or deal with their impurity, are you seeking to continually purge evil from your heart? Are you living the feast of unleavened bread in your life every day? Are you reflecting the fact that Christ has been sacrificed for you? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: celebrate with purity.